Hey, good afternoon. It's great to be here, and it's actually see a lot more friendly faces than I thought. Two, I'd like to call out. One, Ryan Haas, who recruited me for this particular duty, which I'm grateful for, and Bob Wong, who's in the back there, who was the DCM in Beijing when I was there, 2011, 2013, and who taught me more about China than I learned before, probably since. So great to see you both, and I hope I don't disappoint, Bob. The topic today is on the idea of pluralism. And, you know, in this job, as I approach this job, I've had to think through, intellectual trappings for what we're doing here, or what I'm trying to accomplish, or what my advice is to the Secretary. And, you know, trying to distill it down into an idea or maybe a single word is fraught with risk, and I look forward to the debate. But you know, as we think about these things, wrestling with these concepts is just as important, I think, as elucidating them here. So the wrestling for this event was very welcome. Thanks for the opportunity. This discussion today is about the People's Republic of China, but mostly on its impact on the region and our response to the region and the world and those impacts. So I'm going to quickly review policy and then draw out this pluralism theme that comes to mind as we consider this challenge. So first off, policy. I've been fairly public on what that strategy looks like, but just to restate, it's obvious this administration has made long overdue changes to U.S. policy in this region. China is a major consideration of that policy, but so is our relationship with a diverse set of like-minded allies and partners. So 40 years ago, when the PRC began to grow from its ideologically self-imposed isolation and its economic weakness, and now reform and opening at the time, emphasis on opening, required the Chinese Communist Party to adapt to this larger region and world in order to benefit from the benefits of multilateralism. We all understand that it would take some time, but we were encouraged by significant progress in the 1980s. That progress, to me, was best demonstrated at a small dumpling restaurant in Tiananmen that in '88 was privately owned. It was one of the very first experimental private it was public-private, but it was a chance to use this human creativity and initiative and the chance to get rich through your own work and sell a product, in this case dumplings. They had one product and one type of dumpling, and that was it. But the beer was cold, the food was good, and the service was outstanding. Compared to the restaurant next door, which is entirely publicly owned or government-owned, where when you walked in, you had to kind of wake up the staff to, serve you and, all the results from there. So the point there is in the 80s, we did see this burgeoning and this new idea and the energy of the Kentucky Fried Chicken on the west side of Tiananmen Square. And I think it gave us all great hope. It certainly did me. So given those initial hopeful signs, our policy for many years was largely premised on a version of the Golden Rule. American officials hoped that by demonstrating the benefits of openness, we would move Beijing onto a more liberal path, which would lead to greater economic and political openness. I don't need to rehash how that turned out, but it is clear that many of our assumptions were wrong. 20 years of empty post-WTO assurances that China will continue to work toward greater openness has triggered an overdue rethink of our approach to the PRC, its ambitions, and then our response. And this administration now is addressing the PRC as it is and not how we wished it would be. What we have seen over the past 2 decades is that liberal reform has slowed and in some cases reversed. As PRC gained greater wealth and power and grew more integrated with the world, it did not converge with that free and open global order as we expected. Instead, the Chinese Communist Party hopes to reshape the international system to become more compatible with its own authoritarian practices. The Trump administration has been clear that, even as our relationship with the PRC is competitive, we do welcome cooperation where our interests align. Competition does not have to lead to confrontation or conflict. We have a deep respect for the Chinese people, and there is a long history of cooperation as trading partners and even as allies in World War II. And that legacy, of course, is what got me interested in this, since I share the name with one of the key players in that. And so our aim is to defend U.S. sovereignty, advance regional interests, and promote a free, open, and rules-based order in Asia and worldwide. So now the recent shift in U.S. perceptions and policy has triggered some questions. So if the responsible stakeholder notion has been overtaken by reality, what replaces it? We know Washington is against aggressive and threatening conduct by Beijing, but what is Washington for? What's our positive statement on all this? In competing with PRC, are we forcing countries to choose? We hear that a lot. So out of this, the word pluralism is not the complete answer to all these questions, of course, but I think it helps frame where we're going with this and captures something essential about what we mean when we talk about divergent visions of world order. In dictionary terms, you can always start with the definition. Pluralism is about coexistence of multiple things, whether states or groups, principles, opinions, or ways of life. In short, it means diversity or openness. My point in diplomatic terms is that America's foreign policy vision, which is rooted in democratic pluralism at home, supports a corresponding pluralism abroad, too, in the Indo-Pacific region and across the world. Both at home and abroad, we support pluralistic systems governed by freedom, rule of law, and respect for the rights of one's neighbors. And just as our vision of pluralism at home is rooted in the sovereign rights of individuals, our vision of pluralism abroad is rooted in the sovereign rights of states. This has been America's vision for generations. Our challenge today, as in the past, is that the appreciation of pluralism is not universal, so we must come to its defense. We have all heard about a new type vision of global governance, which denigrates pluralism, even though the existing system has served the world, and China included, very well in the 7 decades since World War II. So for details, a pluralistic Asia is one in which the region's diverse countries can continue to thrive as they wish. They are secure in their sovereign autonomy. They are free to be themselves, as Singapore's Lee Kuan Yew put it. No hegemonic power dominates or coerces them. In a pluralistic China, countries enjoy, in a pluralistic Asia, countries enjoy open and shared use of the global commons. International waters and airspace belong to all. No one country can convert them into sole possession or zones of exclusion. Pluralism is essential to our vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific, as President Trump said in Da Nang 2 years ago. Countries in the region should remain a diverse constellation of stars, each shining brightly, but none a satellite to any other. It is important to recognize that the region's countries cherish that vision for themselves. We know this, for example, from the recent ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific, which emphasizes inclusivity to urge respect for all the region's nations, large and small. We know it from the ASEAN Charter, which calls for upholding the principle of unity in diversity. And we know it from Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific vision. We know it from South Korea's New Southern Policy, India's Act East policy, and Australia's Indo-Pacific concept. These all focus on broadening ties to other nations based on rule of law and respect for sovereignty, with shared access to the commons and shared prosperity. So the U.S. supports pluralism, not just in the Indo-Pacific, but around the globe. After World War II, the United States led the creation of a post-war international order that was pluralistic and free to an unprecedented degree. Following the flawed peace of World War I, the post-World War II system was designed to benefit both victors and vanquished, giving all an equal voice in an international forum. Those arrangements aimed to prevent a new world war by ensuring that peace and prosperity could be shared. As with all human endeavors, these things fall short of perfection, but overall, this idea for the last 7 decades has been a stunning success. As President Trump has said in addressing the United Nations, quote, "It is an eternal credit to the American character that even after we and our allies emerged victorious from the bloodiest war in history, we did not seek territorial expansion or attempt to oppose and impose our way on the lives of others. Instead, we helped build institutions such as this one to defend the sovereignty, security, and prosperity of all." This genuine win-win approach fueled the greatest explosion of prosperity that the world has ever seen. This prosperity spread naturally around the globe to countries that opted to join the world economy. The opportunity was seized. Great powers did not dole it out as some kind of imperial largesse. So our approach reflects a view deeply ingrained in American thinking, that fair play is about genuine win-win arrangements. Everyone can benefit if the rules are obeyed. Life is not necessarily zero-sum, and my being strong and prosperous does not require others to be weak or poor. This is also how we conduct international relations. We don't think we're weaker or poorer just because someone else in the world simply makes money or has power. On the contrary, we think the insights of others can benefit us, that the power of others can make the world a safer place, and that the wealth of others means they'll make things we want to buy and buy the things that we make. Such positive, synergistic thinking is inherently pluralistic. This is why the U.S. never sought exclusive power in Asia or the world. With the collapse of Soviet communism in 1991, the United States became, at least for a time, the world's only so-called superpower. But we didn't use that position to keep other countries down. On the contrary, we've invested substantially in the growth of other countries, including China and Japan, and India, and others, to bring about greater wealth and prosperity elsewhere, not just here at home. So that is pluralism, or in political science terms, multipolarity. We don't fear or oppose such multipolarity. On the contrary, we've cultivated it. We want other countries to play important roles in world affairs, to respect shared sets of international rules, and to share the burdens of keeping the world safe and secure. The U.S. does not oppose growth in power and prosperity of other countries. We don't view it as a zero-sum matter or a threat. Just ask Deng Xiaoping. As the historian John Pomfret records, when Deng was flying to the U.S. for his historic first visit after normalization in 1979, his foreign minister asked him why he picked the U.S. for his first trip as the leader. Because, Deng said, America's allies are all rich and strong, and if China wanted to be rich and strong, it needed America. And that's a quote. So there's a lesson here, too, about China's own experience with pluralism. As I mentioned earlier, China was on a better trajectory in its era of reform and opening when it moved toward greater pluralism in politics and policy. This is what I witnessed firsthand in that scratchy dumpling shop near Chemen. At that time, many were fond of quoting Deng Xiaoping's very practical idea that it doesn't matter if a cat is black or white so long as it catches mice. It's both realistic and open to several options, right? Or as maybe more fraught, the concept of let 100 flowers bloom. More pluralism and less authoritarianism would be better for the Chinese people, and certainly better for the world. A less authoritarian China would likely be less aggressive overseas. But the increasing authoritarianism is reflected in this new type governance idea in this region and beyond. So from the other perspective, on Beijing's new type governance idea, Chinese officials have spoken for themselves. I think then Foreign Minister Yang Jiechi summed it up well in 2010 at the ASEAN Regional Forum when he declared that China is a big country and you're all small countries, and that's just a fact. For Beijing, international relations is about hierarchy, and big makes right. It's not respectful of pluralism or sovereign autonomy. Inside China, the Communist Party increasingly enforces political, racial, cultural, digital, and ideological homogeneity. As is increasingly apparent in Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and beyond, Chinese idea of governance is enforcement of uniformity. And at the global level, what is China's view of pluralism? Well, consider how it responded when a single NBA executive tweeted an unwelcome opinion about Hong Kong. Clearly, Beijing's campaign to compel ideological conformity doesn't stop at China's borders. And so, to wrap up, there's a choice before us addressing this idea of, don't force us to choose. So I want to address this relationship between pluralism and choice. If a pluralistic world is one in which countries have the freedom to be themselves, that means they have the freedom to make choices. Pluralism and choice go hand in hand. So let's consider the commonly heard concern that countries will be forced to choose between the U.S. and China. I want you to know they won't be forced to make such a choice by us. When we say that America's vision is pluralistic and inclusive, we mean it, and our record shows it. We aspire to friendly relations with Beijing, and we have no objection if other countries similarly strive to deal with Beijing in cooperative and cordial ways. In our foreign relations, though, all countries constantly make choices about policy issues, about economics, trade, sovereignty, security, etc. These choices affect their interests and their well-being, and we encourage our allies and partners to choose prudently in ways that protect their sovereign national interests. Sovereignty means the ability to live free of foreign domination, to live according to one's own laws, and to make one's own decisions. We're not looking to dictate to others, and we want our allies and friends not to be subject to others' dictates. Choosing for sovereignty is important because without it, the freedom to choose at all could be lost. Choices that preserve sovereignty are choices that preserve the future freedom of choice, which we all cherish. A region in which countries maintain their freedom of choice is a pluralistic region and will be a more prosperous and secure one. I'll close by returning to our policy. It has long been America's view that the post-war international system is sufficiently resilient and adaptable, sufficiently pluralistic to accommodate and gladly incorporate a strong and prosperous China that plays by the rules that have served the world so well for the last 70 years. The system is capable of change and has in fact adapted to many ideas and pressures not imagined decades ago. It remains our hope today that Beijing will return to the path of reform and convergence. More respect for pluralism at home and abroad would be a welcome sign. And with that, I'll conclude. Look forward to your questions and to the upcoming interaction. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much for fascinating talks, and you gave us a lot to ponder. I want to get right to it in the few minutes you and I will have before we bring in many other voices into the conversation and then switch out with the panel at 2:45. There was a specific word you used in your excellent speech that I really noticed and wanted to follow up with when you talked about the U.S. endorsing or being happy with multipolarity. And I wanted to ask you to tease out that concept a little because just not to challenge you, but just for the sake of discussion, I would argue that the U.S. really hasn't favored multipolarity if what you mean is several different power blocks in the world. What we have favored, especially since the Cold War and thereafter, is one power block that's dominant, that we lead, that includes NATO, that U.S. Japan, U.S. Korea, U.S. Australia alliances. Maybe India is even a little closer to us than it is towards any other power block. And by that definition, the United States would favor some version of global leadership that we used to call unipolarity. Maybe it's not quite that. But my guess is you meant something else by multipolarity. So I wanted to ask you to just explicitly answer whether, when you say that term, do you mean a world of multiple separate power centers? Or do you simply mean that we're open about seeing China rise and we accept that China is perhaps going to become another great power, maybe already is, but that we're still looking to maintain a very robust Western alliance system that ideally would be preeminent?
Thank you for that question. I think the presentation, I think, got at that pretty well. What I see, and I think what most people in the administration see, is a system that's benefited all for 70 years. We don't need to update it with some kind of a new type system that, as you read the documentation coming out of Beijing, is asking others to, of their own volition, comport to a process or an idea that does require, compliance. The multipolar system that I'm talking about is one that allowed for and encouraged strong European, strong Asian, strong regions who, in a view of a system that has provided the greatest good and the greatest benefit to the most people, would continue and not be subverted by some new type idea that looks at the world in a different way. And you read the governance of China and other things, and I think that pretty clear about what I'm talking about there. I'm happy to continue to explore that if you want.
So that leads to my next question, which really gets to difficult topics in the news today about the strength of America's commitment to its allies, not only in Asia but around the world. President Trump's on his way to a NATO meeting. We've been talking a lot with reporters and officials about just how robust his commitment is to NATO. Of course, earlier this year he said maybe the U.S.-Japan alliance wasn't necessarily permanent. Now, the one interpretation of this is President Trump's a good negotiator, and he wants more host nation support. He wants more burden sharing. He's trying to get more of that from countries you work on, Korea, Japan. Secretary Esper was just in Northeast Asia talking with those countries. He's continued on in the region. Another interpretation is that President Trump really isn't sure how much he values these alliances. And especially, frankly, if he's reelected and has another 4 years, there's no telling if the alliances will continue. So without asking you to get into too much White House politics, I did want to ask, what is the strongest statement you can make about America's commitment to its alliances in Asia at this point? How central and enduring are those commitments?
Well, we'll start tactical. I mean, if you look at my travel schedule, I've spent almost half of my time that I've been in the job on the road, and my first 2 stops and my first 3 trips all dealt with our allies, Korea, Japan, Philippines, Thailand, Australia, plus our strong security partners to include Singapore and others. I operate in accordance with and aligned with the administration's policies. And so that perspective should not be drowned out by the call it noise that goes with the president's insistence that as the security background changes and as our partners have become wealthier and more capable of taking care of their own security, as well as our shared security interests, that they take care of that they invest in that as a show of alignment, as a show of support, and a demonstration of our concerns about the changes that are taking place in the region.
So if we can ask them to help us evolve the alliances and do more of their share, there's no reason for them to doubt our enduring commitment to them. Is that a fair distillation of where we stand with the Indo-Pacific strategy and the overall thrust of U.S. foreign policy?
I think so. I don't want to say complacent or taking for granted, but I've got personally 2 tours in Korea. I've got 2 tours in Japan, 6 total years. 1 as a commander at Misao Air Base, and I've seen all of them both step up to the challenge since my first tour there in 1980, and their capabilities grow exponentially. And I see opportunities for further cooperation and ability to use their capabilities as well as ours in a cooperative way.
I just want to ask really one more question about the allies, and I think it's sort of a general interest to a lot of us how to think about the different types of alliances we have in the Asia-Pacific today. And maybe you could, I don't want to go into great depth on each one. We don't have time, and I want to bring in the audience soon. But I wonder if you could help us understand. Clearly, the U.S.-Japan and U.S.-ROK alliances in the northeast part of Asia are at the cornerstone of dealing with the immediate threat from North Korea and China, and also really where our troops are in the greatest numbers. And the U.S.-Australia alliance is also very robust. Beyond that, I don't know which ones to call robust at this juncture. We have a U.S.-Philippine treaty that's backstopped by a very strong mutual security treaty, but it's not entirely clear how committed each government is, especially perhaps the Duterte government in Manila, to the alliance right now. We have a U.S.-New Zealand alliance that is historically strong and still has some areas of cooperation often outside the immediate region, but has been in a little bit different status since the 1980s.
Right.
And then we have a U.S.-Thailand alliance that is a formal alliance, but it's hard to think of it as quite in the same category with U.S.-ROK, U.S.-Japan. Maybe you'll correct me. And then, as you say, Singapore, a very important informal security partner without a treaty. Right. So how should we understand the U.S. commitment to those different types of allies?
Well, to play some to just work in terms of gradations, I don't think helps anything. But I do want to note, first off, 5 security alliances in the region, strong security partnership with New Zealand, and as you mentioned, Singapore as well. To talk about, you have rhetoric, and you know this here, living in D.C., you've got the rhetoric and you've got the facts. And the facts are that the relationships in Philippines, Thailand, Australia, and other places, the activities haven't gone down. The cooperation, the training, the shared capabilities are very much. I mean, look at Marawi in the Philippines. We really weighed in quickly and positively to manage a problem that was nobody wanted to deal with in the region. So look at the facts and not necessarily the rhetoric. And I think that would be a better way of measuring. But again, to try to grade them or put them in a hierarchy, I don't think benefits anyone.
So my last question is going to really it's a little bit open-ended, but to ask you to describe for us of the various places we see China active and militarily concerning. East China Sea with the Senkaku Islands, South China Sea with all the different reclaimed islands and military deployments and developments, the Taiwan situation. Is there any one that for you right now, and I'll give you the choice how you want to answer this, either causes you the most heartburn and anxiety, or has you feeling the best, that we're sort of working our way towards a more effective policy that seems like, at least for the foreseeable future, is likely to be durable and keep deterrence robust? So I'll give you the choice if you want to look for the glass half empty or the glass half full answer to the question.
Well, I think, probably the easiest way to answer that is to look at the South China Sea in 2015 and look at it today. With the increasing activity, freedom of navigation and those things, that I dealt with when I was back at Indo-PACOM a year ago. Those things do seem to have demonstrated resolve, demonstrated capability, and then asked China to live up to its commitments of peaceful rise, which, as we know, the Spratlys and the militarization sort of belie other intentions. And so I think what we have seen, the issues with Vietnam and the Vanguard banks and those things notwithstanding, is a China that understands that we do mean what we say and that our security commitments are as stated. And again, putting words to actions, and that demonstrates trust both for our allies and also tells Beijing they can believe what we're saying.
Great. Well, let me please bring in some of the audience. Please wait for a microphone and mention your name before you ask a question. We'll go here with the fourth row, please. Yeah, right there, please.
Chia Cheng with United News Group Taiwan. Two questions, if I may. First,
how about we do this one, because I'm going to only got 10 minutes.
One question. Assistant Secretary, you mentioned that you visit Japan and other Asian countries to show your support. In that sense, do you plan to visit Taiwan to show U.S. support? Thank you.
Well, that's an easy answer. You mentioned countries, and the U.S. abides by the Taiwan Relations Act and the 3 communiques. And so I'm going to defer that one and note that, again, we support that, and I won't refer to Taiwan as a country. So thank you.
Go here to Lynn in the second row, please.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Secretary Stilwell. I want to return to the question of terminology. I was recently at the Berlin Foreign Policy Forum, and the word multilateralism came up a lot at that conference. And today you mentioned the word pluralism a lot. Could you tell me how the notion of pluralism is different from the notion of multilateralism? Also, does the notion of pluralism actually embrace the notion of like a shared rules-based grouping, or is it about unity and diversity, as you also mentioned in your speech? So does it matter that parties, share the same values? Thank you.
We wrestled with that for a while, and I don't think you have to share the same values domestically, but you have to allow those values elsewhere, right? We would certainly like to see what we believe is the best method of governance, which is a open, pluralistic, and a system that allows multiple voices to be heard, to give people voice to be heard and choice, as we say. So I think to us that's the most resilient. It may not be the most responsive, as Winston Churchill says, democracy is a terrible form of governance, but it's the best one going. It can be, can be kind of muddled, but it from my experience, having lived in several parts of the world, it certainly is the best one that I know of. And so on the one hand, we encourage other countries to maintain that approach, but at the same time, we can't insist on that. We talked about sovereignty in this conversation as well. And sovereign countries make sovereign choices. That's not ours to dictate, but how they deal with others, I do believe, is something that we should insist on in a way where we're not dictating terms to others.
We go to the woman in the second seat in the sixth row here. Actually, that's okay. We'll go to the back of the room first, and then we'll come up to the sixth row next, please.
Thank you so much, Chen Liu from Xinhua News Agency, and thanks for Mr. Stilwell's speech. You've just mentioned in your speech that the U.S. is not forcing other countries to take sides between U.S. and China, but actually in the past various public speech by Secretary Pompeo, we can see that Pompeo just talked about 5G, Huawei, and the investment from China, and said that the U.S. could or just warn other countries that if they use Huawei, the 5G, and the money from China, then probably there will be some consequences from the U.S. So if that's not asking countries to take sides, then how could you describe it? Thank you.
That's a good question, and one that always bears clarification. The issue with information systems has to do with one's own security. And in a globalized world where the security choice of one person affects the security of others, the security choice of one sovereign country impacts sovereignty of others, that's something to be concerned about. And so if we're going to share information with countries, we want to share it on systems that we know are secure. And there's ample proof that says not just domestic laws, but other things that show that those systems, Huawei in this case, have issues that don't guarantee that sense. These are things that we took for granted before, and now we're having to think more clearly about.
So we're here in the sixth row, second person in, please.
Thank you. Rita Chen with Radio Free Asia. My question is about Hong Kong. Since the President Trump has enacted a bill of Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, from your initial evaluation, is keeping Hong Kong as a separate custom territory still Americans' interest nowadays? And then China has retaliated by suspend the U.S. naval visit to Hong Kong and sanction some U.S. NGOs. What is your response to your Chinese counterpart? Thank you.
The agreement in 1997, or before that, but the one that went into force in 97, allowed Hong Kong to maintain certain privileges that that are distinct from the mainland in terms of one country, two systems. We of course would like to maintain that because that's the agreement we all came to. 50 years of basically autonomy, and anything that infringes on that, of course, if you look at the Hong Kong Policy Act and the follow-on Human Rights and Democracy Act, as that autonomy gets squeezed, we already have to, and with the passage of this new act, we'll continue to report on our assessment of where that autonomy stands. Is it sufficiently autonomous? Because if it is not, then the law says that we have to take certain actions that will affect the ability as a trading zone and other things. And so we, of course, would prefer that there's no violence. We'd also prefer that the Beijing live up to its commitment to preserve the autonomy of Hong Kong in accordance with the basic law and others.
We have time for one more question. Scott, over here on the far side of the auditorium, and then we'll wrap up. And as we're waiting for the microphone, after we finish and Mr. Secretary departs the stage and we thank him, we're going to do a seamless transition, if we could, to the panel. And I'd ask you to just stay where you are for that second phase of the day.
Thank you, Michael. Mr. Secretary, recently you and other senior U.S. government officials made very clear to our partners and allies in Seoul that we had an interest at stake in their decision about whether or not to sever or renew or persist in their intelligence sharing agreement with Japan. That agreement is now temporarily suspended, the withdrawal, but South Korea has said that they could still withdraw at any time, and they are hoping that Japan will make some forward progress on a trade dispute. Irrespective of the trade issue or any other issue, do you see a continuing role for the United States in communicating to our allies in Seoul and Tokyo that we have continuing expectations, or do you believe that we have now made clear our position and that we no longer have anything else left to communicate?
Well, in true political sense, I will pick both. As you saw, both from my statements and others, that we do clearly have an interest in maintaining this information sharing agreement, especially as respect to North Korean provocations. And so we were active not in resolving this issue, but encouraging both sides to, acknowledge the importance of maintaining a strong security face, toward Pyongyang. At the same time, personally, we're watching the bow rise, to use a naval term. Both sides see the importance of getting their relationship squared away, which, of course, I'm happy about and continue to encourage. But I've talked about sovereignty during the speech. They're sovereign nations, and I'm in no mood or capability or in no mind to somehow dictate terms, but to reason with both sides and to help them understand our interests in this situation. And, we'll continue to do that as we go on.
Please join me in thanking Secretary Stilwell.